From Kona to Yenan, The Political Memoirs of Koji Ariyoshi. Chapter 13, Diplomacy and Special Envoy Hurly. After Chiang Kai-shek finally permitted foreign correspondents to enter Chinese-led areas in the late spring of 1944, and the subsequent establishment in Yenan of the U.S. Army Observer Section, relations between U.S. Army headquarters in Chongqing and the Yenan government were cordial. This relationship naturally resulted in cooperation between American personnel and the Chinese in liberated and guerrilla areas. Rescued American pilots who were shot down behind Japanese lines were led to safety by People's Militiamen, guerrillas or regular army units. The Chinese communists did not charge the Americans for rescue work, while nationalist units were always dickering for higher payment from us whenever they were turning over downed pilots. In the field of military intelligence we were getting valuable information about the Japanese army. But the basis of this relationship, which GIs termed honeymoon, was a common interest in defeating the enemy and the fact that in North China the Chinese were fighting an all-out war, which was not the case with Chiang's outfit. Chiang hated General Stilwell, who constantly pressed him to use his troops against the Japanese, and through his machination had Stilwell, a truly great American, removed. Chiang wanted to save his U.S. armed and trained troops to fight the communists after the defeat of the Japanese. A few days after the Stilwell recall we heard over the radio in Yenan that Ambassador Clarence E. Gauss had resigned from his Chongqing post. Both Stilwell and Gauss had wanted a united China, with Chongqing and Yenan brought together to fight the Japanese. They saw that steps to bring unity must include sweeping reforms to democratize the nationalists. Lieutenant General Albert C. Wedemeyer succeeded Stilwell, and he said, when he assumed command of the U.S. forces in the China theater, that he would not meddle in Chinese politics. He also said, after the war, the people of China can determine by whom they will be governed. At this crucial moment when Chiang seemed to have won a victory in forcing President Roosevelt to recall Stilwell, the focus of interest in China and abroad was not on Wedemeyer but on Presidential Envoy Major General Patrick J. Hurly. Our diplomats are generally men of wealth, sent off by Washington to establish or maintain amicable relationships with foreign powers. At times a diplomatic post becomes a center of intrigue, to influence the removal or overthrow of an unfriendly foreign regime. The diplomatic posts are also the eyes and ears of our government. If militant trade unionists or their leaders were appointed diplomats, they undoubtedly would not encourage the support of corrupt and anti-labor regimes like those of Chiang Kai-shek, Bao Dai in Indochina, or of repressive Syngman Rhee. But for our country to have such a corps of diplomats in foreign outposts, the voice of the working people must become dominant in Washington. As it is, with 60 million workers in our country, we do not have one representative of labor in Congress. A man like John Foster Dulles, therefore, can step into government at will and become the architect of the unilateral Wall Street-inspired Japanese peace treaty. In the face of overwhelming opposition in Japan to the treaty, which is history, it was rammed down the throats of the Japanese people. In Paris, the same Dulles a couple of weeks ago advocated war with the Soviet Union and China by aggressively hitting explosive spots such as Indochina. The world remembers that Dulles was the one who made a hurried trip to Tokyo and the 38th parallel in Korea on the eve of the Korean War. Patrick J. Hurly, an Oklahoma oil millionaire, was such a man. When he arrived in China in 1944 as President Roosevelt's diplomatic troubleshooter, he could not appreciate the fundamental changes taking place in a semi-feudal, semi-colonial country. He apparently thought of patching the tattered relationship between Chongqing and Yenan and so go down in history as a diplomatic savior of China. His unexpected arrival in Yenan drew the interest of the world to the pastoral, hinterland capital of the Chinese Communists. On November 7, 1944, we expected a transport from the 10th Weather Squadron stationed in Chengdu, but not from our headquarters in Chongqing. No sooner had the weather plane set down its wheels on the Yenan airstrip than 4 fighters suddenly came roaring out of the south, circled over our valley and buzzed low over the runway to give it the once-over. Then from the west a C-47 came droning over the airfield at a more leisurely pace. Colonel David Barrett, our observer section commander, began giving orders in great excitement. Get Mao Zedong down to the airfield right away. Tell him General Hurly is here. The airfield was quite a distance from the date garden where Mao and General Chu Tai lived. In the meantime, General Hurly, tall, trim and strikingly colorful, stepped down from his plane, his every move seemingly calculated to produce the best poses for the cameras which were already clicking. Finally, the Chinese leaders arrived. Mao stepped out of his vehicle and casually threw one end of his knitted woolen scarf across his shoulder. He was tall and of medium build. A deep cotton cap covered his long, jet black hair and partly hid his high forehead, features sharply characterized in his portraits etched on village walls and public buildings all over Red China. He was dressed simply, like his colleagues, and he gave a surface appearance of an odd combination of an intellectual and a peasant. A liaison officer spoke to Mao, who hurried to meet Hurly. As Mao smilingly approached Hurly with extended hand, every eye turned on them. For in this pastoral setting, history was being made. For 17 years the Chinese communists had been called bandits, and at one time high prices had been put on the heads of top leaders, dead or alive, by Chiang. Once Chiang offered $250,000 Chinese for Mao's head. Mao answered by offering $1 for Chiang's head. Repeated bandit suppression campaigns had dislodged the Reds from southeast China, and they marched 8,000 miles to northwest China. They grew phenomenally in strength during the anti-Japanese war, and now an American presidential envoy had come to them in mediating nationalist-communist negotiations. Mao was then a leader of 90 million Chinese. When the handshaking ceremony was over, Generals Hurly and Chu Te led in reviewing the guards of honor. Captain John Calling of the OSS trained his motion picture camera on the colorful Hurly, who within the busy next hour instructed the captain and all GIs with cameras that he wanted all the negatives of pictures taken of him. The subject was worth $1 million, the contrast was perfect. Here were modern aircraft against a background of eroded hills, caves, white turban, smiling peasants and ox carts, and sheepskin-clad nomads with a camel caravan. A tall millionaire, decked in the best uniform money could buy, ornamented with brass and ribbons galore, marched beside stout General Chu Te, plainly and simply attired, like the guards in cotton-padded uniforms who were being reviewed. Hurly, an Oklahoma orphan who had worked in coal mines and became a lawyer and an oil magnate, was a Horatio Alger character and the incarnation of American industrial capitalism. Chu Te, who had given away his birthright of wealth and eminent military rank in the old feudal society, and had broken away from the opium habit and concubines for the simple and harsh life of a revolutionary, personified China's workers and peasants. Like a seasoned ham actor, Hurly played up to the cameras. Auspiciously he gripped the visor of his cap with a sweep of his hand, swung the cap over his head, and there he vigorously waved it in short spiral motions as he pierced the North China stillness with a blood-curdling whooping yahoo of the Choctaw Indians. Chu Te was startled in the midst of this solemn military ceremony. For a few seconds he gaped at Hurly, who had regained his composure and was looking straight into the cameras as he continued to pass in review. "Why, a peacock couldn't have done any better," someone commented. "When I met General Hurly, Sergeant Shonomura went with me." The general wore a good-sized white mustache, neatly trimmed and curled up at the ends with what seemed to me a generous application of wax. This was the most striking thing about him that I saw in a flash. As Colonel Barrett presented us Nisei to him, Hurly drew back his broad, square shoulders and stiffened his spine, shook our hands and remarked with a grin, "I see we have many Americans here." That evening we were all invited to the 18th Group Army headquarters with General Hurly to a banquet observing the anniversary of the Russian Revolution. When the banquet began, toasts were given in rapid succession to the Russian Revolution, Marshal Stalin, victory for President Roosevelt in the election against Thomas Dewey, and the defeat of the fascist nations. Then came a toast to welcome the presidential envoy to Yenan. Part of Hurly's discussions with the Chinese communist officials took place right outside a mud shack in which I lived for a time in Yenan. There in the open courtyard he talked with Chu En-lai, through the latter's interpreter, Chien Chia-kan. I became keenly interested in the Hurly mission, for the U.S. relationship with China would hinge on its outcome. We listened to table conversation and learned interesting details. In the U.S. Army Observer section, equalitarianism was emphasized to the extreme to impress the communists, and so we enlisted men at the same table with officers. I learned that at the first meeting of Hurly and Mao Zedong, the presidential envoy first stated Chiang Kai-shek's proposals. Chiang demanded that the communists put their armies and territories under him in return for his concessions, which included legal status for the communists, a seat in the Supreme National Defense Council, and some lend-lease supplies. As General Hurly talked, an expression of annoyance came to Chairman Mao's face. Mao denounced Chiang. He asked how could the communist armies and millions of people in areas carved behind enemy lines by blood and tears be given up to the corrupt Chongqing government, a regime in which the people of the communists led liberated areas and the vast majority of people in Kuomintang, China had no voice. He lashed out against Chiang for his government's corruption, graft-ridden conscription system, its passive war policy, and defeatism. Hurly parried with a statement that Mao was only repeating what the Japanese said about Chiang. He said he considered Mao and Chiang the first patriots of China. Mao replied that he was not repeating the enemy's words, but was expressing similar views expressed by President Roosevelt, Churchill, Sun Fo and Madame Sun Yat-sen, and that he offered his criticism to improve China. Hurly backed down and said he understood what Mao meant. He suggested that this part of the discussion be cut out of the record and they start all over again. The morning following his arrival in Yenan, Hurly and Colonel David Barrett, our commanding officer, headed across the Yen River to the other side of the valley to continue discussion with Yenan leaders. When they returned to our compound, they sat in the open space right outside my shack. Hurly sprawled on a beach chair with his legs stretched far out. The short, chunky colonel held the front part of a small stool on which he sat and rocked back and forth while he listened to the long-winded presidential envoy. Hurly planned to leave on the 4th day after his arrival. Fairly early that morning, Chu Enlai came to see him. Hurly was again sunning himself outside my shack. Their discussion centered on a piece of paper Hurly held in a gesticulating hand. Here I shall quote from my personal note. General Hurly seemed to have written his opinion in the document, and it seemed that upon this piece of paper, which he handed Chu Enlai, negotiations were to continue in Chungking. The general mentioned Roosevelt's 4 freedoms several times and said fear was the point he had stressed in drafting the document. The general said, freedom from fear is the basis for establishing the coalition government of China to fight the common enemy, Japan. Once united, there should be no fear of communism. After Chu had left, Colonel Barrett talked with Hurly. Then shortly afterwards both of them went across the river for further discussion. They took up the document which Hurly had earlier handed to Chu Enlai. This became known as Hurly's 5 points, which he drew up in English and had translated for Mao and his colleagues. 3 points of the 5 were Hurly's ideas, couched in his exact words. The other 2, coalition government and united command of China's armies, nationalist and communist, were Mao's suggestions expressed in Hurly's own words. Independently and of his own volition, Hurly had added all the fancy trimmings of phraseology and injected such items as the supplies acquired from foreign powers will be equitably distributed. But a few months later, after negotiations failed, he told correspondents in Washington that to give arms to the communists would be like recognizing another Chinese regime. In a matter-of-fact manner he included such clauses as the right of writ of habeas corpus and the right of residence, which a person who knew about Chiang's concentration camps and his Tai Lai secret police would never have thrown in such a casual manner. After Mao Zedong read the 5 points, Hurly asked Mao if he would sign them. Mao said he would, and wrote his signature. Hurly then signed as a witness. Now all that the 5 points required to start off negotiations with a bang, as Hurly expected, was Chiang Kai-shek's signature. This, Hurly seemed confident of obtaining. The presidential envoy reassured Mao that after all the 5 points were merely a genuine expression of Jeffersonian democracy. Then he smiled and looked Mao straight in the eyes. Mao held back his smile until he had heard what Hurly had said through an interpreter. Then he beamed and nodded his head. Hurly next suggested that Mao write a letter to President Roosevelt, stating that his envoy was successfully carrying out his mission and that Mao appreciated Hurly's endeavors. In return, Hurly said he would write a letter in behalf of President Roosevelt, stating that the United States appreciated the remarkable war effort of the Chinese communists. After these details had been cleared away, Hurly was overcome with optimism, since the conversation progressed so smoothly. He probably pictured Mao sitting in Chungking, working closely at Chiang's elbow. Out of a clear sky he invited the communist leader, for whose head Chiang once offered $250,000 to fly to Chungking with him and live in the American embassy under United States protection. Mao answered that he was busy but would send Chu Enlai with Chen Chiakang as interpreter. As a passing remark, Mao told Hurly that should negotiations fail, Yenan would call a conference of the liberated areas to establish a centralized administration. This would have meant a separate government in North China. We went down to the airfield to observe Hurly's departure. Hundreds of Chinese thronged the runway to get a glimpse of the presidential envoy. All over Yenan blackboard newspapers and large slogans chalked on walls featured the Hurly visit, with heavy emphasis on hope for Chinese unity. The natives smiled, for this meant the lifting of the nationalist blockade of their areas and no civil war. To students who had come in from nationalist China, it meant freedom to go anywhere in their own country to pursue a livelihood. They could even go home without being picked up by Tai Lai agents. To Hurly, with all his dramatics, the millions of Chinese did not seem to be of concern. He was like a chess player, thinking in terms of dealing with a few top leaders. What he did not appreciate was the fact that in economically poor North China, the millions who for the first time enjoyed a new deal and greater freedom supported their leaders. The people wanted a change and they were getting it. Chiang resisted it. Hurly took off and we next heard that he caught a cold and spent a couple of days in bed. When he went to Chiang, the latter firmly rejected his Jeffersonian democracy. It was common talk in Chungking that Hurly complained that TV soon had ruined his efforts by briefing Chiang in advance. With negotiations broken down, the 5 points and Jeffersonian democracy became mere words. In the weeks that followed, Hurly sided with Chiang, and his attitude was regarded in China as not dissimilar to that of the Generalissimo. This developed into a get tough with Yenan policy, and long before Japanese capitulation, Chiang boldly began attacking the guerrilla areas, using weapons supplied by the U.S. by then President Roosevelt had died and U.S. policy had changed. My first trip from Yenan back to Chungking was the most exciting trip I ever made, and I do not believe I exaggerate when I say that I played a small part in averting what could have developed into an embarrassing situation for our country, or possibly into an international situation. It was April 2nd, 1945. The Yenan airstrip was crowded and all its leaders were there. It was a big day, for the Chinese Communist delegation headed by elder statesman Tung Pai-wu was leaving for the United Nations Conference in San Francisco. They were flying on a U.S. transport. I was traveling on the same plane. We flew to Sion, Chiang's frontier bastion, where he kept 500,000 of his best troops facing Yenan, instead of using them to fight the Japanese militarists. Since the weather was bad, the pilot said we would fly above the storm and head for Chungking. For an hour we tried to gain altitude, but we could not get above the storm without oxygen masks. So we turned back and landed at Sion. As we alighted from the plane, I discovered that we had 6 communists with us in this city dominated by Kuomintang's secret police. Being the only American among the passengers, I became their escort. I made arrangements for billeting. I spoke to an extremely cooperative air transportation command captain who soon realized our security risk. He said the Chinese delegation were General Albert Wedemeyer's guests, since they were flying on our plane, and we must give them the fullest protection. The captain had his hands full, since the Japanese army was driving toward Sion and all foreign missionaries throughout the area were clamoring to be evacuated by air. The airport was crowded. Our pilot came to me and suggested that we try for Chungking again. We took off and bucked through the storm for 4 hours. It was already dark. Tung Pai-wu, the gray-haired, bearded delegate to the UNO, was lying down. All his staff, including his witty interpreter, Chan Chia-kan, were sick, terribly sick. We were all worried, since a trip from Sion to Chungking normally took only 2.5 hours. We were 1 hour and a half overdue. Sergeant Ariyoshi, I think we are lost, Chia-kan said to me very sadly, too sick to get excited. Don't you think we are over Japanese lines? He asked. I went forward to the cockpit. The pilot told me that we had spent an hour gaining altitude and now we were going down to Chengdu, not Chungking. When I told this to Chia-kan and Tung, the latter smiled. We are not too far from Tibet, Tung said. I nodded. He closed his eyes. I watched him lying there with a blanket thrown over him. About 10 years before, he had climbed Tibetan mountains in the historic long march of 8,000 miles when he was past 50. Many of his comrades had fallen on mountain peaks where rarefied air had exhausted them. Tung and other survivors had to push on without them. In this march, he had led a women's group of about 30 members, moving swiftly with the troops, often ahead of them to do public relations work and win the friendship of the native populace so that the troops would be fed and billeted. I regretted that we were flying through a storm. Otherwise, I would talk to him. He had played such a vital role in Chinese history in cooperation with Dr. Sun Yat-sen and in the Nationalist Party during the revolution of the mid-20s. Before we retired that night I thought we might be able to talk about the Long March, which is a fascinating story in itself. I did not get this opportunity. When we landed at Chengdu, we found the American quarters filled to overflowing by missionary evacuees from Sion. Some were sleeping in tents. Strong winds and heavy rain were sweeping through the city. I went up to a U.S. Air Corps lieutenant and explained to him that for security reasons the communists must be billeted in the American hostile area. I told him that it would be unwise to send the Yenan delegation to the Nationalist Air Corps hostel. The officer felt that Chinese were Chinese and the Nationalist secret police wouldn't do anything to the communists. I could have told him of the hundreds of people who had disappeared and of the concentration camps. But there was no point in arguing, for the officer was in a terrible mood because missionary evacuees, whose destination was Chungking, kept landing at Chengdu because of the bad weather. I stayed with the communists as a self-appointed escort. As soon as we arrived in the Chinese hostile area, nationalist soldiers stared, first with curiosity, then with hostility at the communists, whose Yenan-made uniforms gave away their identities. I asked the American sergeant who drove us to the billet to get us a separate room. The nationalist hostile officer argued that the communists could sleep in a corner of a barracks where nationalist pilots were sitting up in bed, watching the communists. The Chinese officer argued that I go to the American area. Other Chinese Air Corps officers joined in the argument, saying that since nationalist pilots who flew with U.S. pilots were segregated at the air base, why should I, an American, live in their hostel? They were bitter at the segregation policy, but I sensed that they did not want me around for other reasons. The nationalists gathered around me and tried to prevent me from calling the base headquarters. An officer answered and I explained the situation to him. He spoke to the nationalist officer and told him that the U.S. Army would pay for my lodging. I also asked for 2 MP sentries right away. I finally managed to get a small, separate room for the communists. I locked the door. Humanitarian soldiers and pilots gathered outside our door, jabbered and periodically pounded on it. I did not sleep, and I believe the communists were wide awake. I expected anything to happen. I did not dare open the door to call the sentries who were quite a distance out on the street. The nationalists harassed us until almost 2 in the morning, when an MP lieutenant came. I asked for additional sentries to stand outside our door. Early the following morning the American base headquarters sent a truck for us. A major, who was officer of the day, came to apologize. He had heard the Communist UN delegation was traveling on General Wedemeyer's invitational orders, and now this gave him reason to worry. He assured me this sort of thing would not happen again. I told him that I had tried to get him by phone, and since he was out, I had left a message for him. The major stayed with us for about 15 minutes to make amends by lively conversation until we started out for the airstrip. Any incident that night might have had wide repercussions. Town Paiwu was attending the UNO conference partially through Ambassador Hurly's persuasion of the nationalists to include communist delegates. And on the very day we arrived in Chengdu, Hurly was telling newspapermen in Washington that the Chinese communist-led forces were as if all us Republicans were armed. Hurly had reversed himself, for he had once even talked of supplying Yenan with arms if his 5 points brought about Chinese unity. When correspondents asked him whether the U.S. would arm the guerrilla forces, Hurly replied that to give assistance of that type to any faction or political party would amount to recognizing another Chinese regime. This remark by Hurly touched off a series of sharp attacks against him from Yenan. Hurly, as a mediator, was finished. Many times after this I wondered what would have happened diplomatically if anything had happened to us that nightmarish, sleepless night at Chengdu. This was one of those small stories which might have been an explosive one. I was glad when Tung and his group arrived safely in Chongqing. During the few occasions when I was sent in from the field to the U.S. Army headquarters in China to report to General Albert C. Wedemeyer in 1945, I noticed that the general and his staff were keenly interested in certain questions. How strong were the Chinese communist-led forces? How would they measure up against U.S.-trained and equipped Chinese nationalist forces under Chiang Kai-shek? As an observer in North China, making a particular study of troop morale and psychological warfare of the Japanese and Chinese communist-led forces, I was able to report in some detail. Right after Japanese capitulation, I recall being asked what would be the result of Chinese nationalist occupation of North China. We were then airlifting Chiang's troops from South China into areas occupied by the Japanese in North China. I remember answering that if we were to place Chiang's troops into the exact positions occupied by the Japanese in the cities and along strategic railway and communication lines, the nationalists would not be able to maintain their positions, even with American help. They would be occupational troops in islands surrounded by hostile guerrilla-occupied territories. In a stalemate or in a protracted war of attrition, troop morale is important, and a politically conscious soldier would have a higher morale than one who was not fighting for a cause. The Japanese soldiers, for instance, were fanatics, intensely indoctrinated with the Yamato spirit. They fought with a determination that was awesome to the Westerners during the major part of the Pacific War. On the North China fronts the Japanese were losing the psychological warfare. To put a demoralized, politically weak and corrupt nationalist army in their place meant they would eventually collapse from a combined military and psychological onslaught. In September 1945, on a trip I made to Chongqing, my superiors did not agree with me, but I told them what I had observed and learned. It was a time when it was felt in certain high positions that the nationalists could fan out in North China, and with U.S. assistance destroy the anti-Japanese resistance forces led by the communists. I remember telling General Wedemeyer the story of Blockhouse 50, which I shall relate here in greater detail. The 80th Battalion, or Taketai, was garrisoned in a county in North Hope Province in 1944. It was a crack outfit, and was marked for Pacific duty in the spring of 1945. It dominated the county by a network of blockhouses, solid castles of brick and stone in which the soldiers lived. In the spring and autumn the soldiers sauntered out to mop up the countryside, plunder grain, and return to their strongholds. The guerrillas constantly harassed the Japanese troops. Toward the spring of 1945, the Japanese command issued an order to blockhouses on the perimeter, instructing those in charge not to let their men outside. When Japanese army messengers and mail carriers traveled to outpost blockhouses, a squad went along as escort. When a captain went on an inspection tour of blockhouses, a section accompanied him. Blockhouse 50 was in one of the perimeter villages in the county. Like the others, it was an island of tyranny in the middle of resisting China. It was formidable, with a tower full of loopholes for machine guns and rifles. Around it was a high wall, and beyond it the remnants of the blockhouse which had been destroyed by Chinese Reds. The demolished fortress once housed puppet troops that had been locally conscripted. The Chinese Communist forces, who carried on vast propaganda offensives against their own people, used families and friends of these puppets to visit them, bring them food and propaganda literature to explain their traitorous roles. Finally, the puppets deserted on a prearranged night. The guerrillas tore down the walls and blew up the blockhouse. This left Blockhouse 50 without any outer defense. 16 Japanese soldiers lived in Blockhouse 50. Formerly there were 17, but Corporal Shiratori had been captured by the Reds. Lieutenant Koga, who was in charge of the blockhouse, was high-strung, nervous and mean to his men, especially to Private Morimoto, a man of 40 who constantly thought of his home and children. Koga had a habit of telephoning adjacent blockhouses every night to ascertain whether guerrillas had shown any signs of life. In the daytime, he searched the baskets and clothing of Chinese peasants who brought vegetables and meat to his blockhouse. He confiscated all leaflets sent by the Japanese prisoner converts who were on the communist side. Once he nearly killed a peasant boy who brought letters to his men from the Japanese People's Emancipation League. On another occasion he suspected Morimoto of writing a letter to the JPEL, and he slapped and kicked the private until he himself collapsed from exhaustion. That night the lieutenant heard a familiar voice. The guerrillas were around his blockhouse and JPEL members were night broadcasting under cover of the darkness. Through a megaphone, they began shouting, "Good evening, Lieutenant Koga. Are you there? Who wants to know?" shouted Koga, and from a loophole he fired a burst from a machine gun. "I am Corporal Shiratori. Do you remember me? I am now a member of the Japanese People's Emancipation League. You damn fool. Traitor. You are a disgrace to the Emperor." And he furiously sprayed the area with machine gun bullets and yelled at his own men to keep firing. When the din died down, from the darkness beyond, nostalgic recorded music came to them. The men stood by loopholes with ears turned to catch every refrain. "Why did you beat Private Morimoto today? Why don't you let Corporal Noguchi read our leaflets?" shouted Shiratori. "Shiratori, if you are a Japanese you will return to the Imperial Army. I will give you the opportunity." "No thank you, I am much happier here. Japan is fighting an unjust war. Why do you kill the Chinese, rape innocent women and children, and take grain?" The night wore on and Koga got angrier and sporadically shot into the darkness from where the voices came. Each time phonograph music drifted back to the blockhouse. Shiratori said he knew Private Ono's sore foot was not any better because Koga would not send him to the hospital. "Did Private Ushio receive any letter after the last one he got 3 weeks ago?" Shiratori asked. He was reading letters which the guerrillas captured and later forwarded to the blockhouse. He told Koga he was sending his former comrades comfort kits, rice wine and playing cards the next day, and asked the officer not to confiscate them. Koga ordered his men to fire at Shiratori in order to drown out his voice. After 3 hours, Shiratori vanished as suddenly as he had come. Koga spent a restless night and put extra guards out on the parapet. Twice a week Shiratori returned, and he got bolder each time. He urged the soldiers to disobey Koga, a rotten officer. He explained about the JPEL and asked them to come over. He also tapped telephone wires, listened in on conversations which went on between blockhouses, talked to the soldiers. Sometimes he cut in while Koga was talking and the lieutenant would hang up angrily. Koga shifted his demoralized men and brought in fresh troops. Shiratori learned their names, where their native homes were, and how they felt toward Koga. Once Private Mori, a secret member of the JPEL recruited in Blockhouse 50, informed Shiratori through a Chinese peddler that Koga had received an order to go on a pillaging expedition. When Koga went on his mission with 50 men, puppet transport laborers and carts, he found all the grain hidden and not a peasant left in the villages. Shiratori ribbed Koga about this in his night broadcast. Mori deserted to the JPEL one dark night. This news was shouted a few nights later. Then Corporal Godu and Private Ashino slipped away during a pillaging expedition. They searched the countryside for the communist-led guerrillas and were captured by militiamen who took them to headquarters, where Shiratori welcomed them. In all, Koga lost 9 men through desertion. Out of these, 5 came to Yenan and I talked with them. Blockhouse 50 was just one stronghold of numerous fortresses which were neutralized. Before the war ended, it became untenable and was evacuated. Like water eroding a pebble, propaganda ate away at the ideologically under-equipped enemy which startled the West with its fanatics. The Chinese communists had a more powerful weapon in the justice of their defense against aggression. The Japanese POW converts believed in them and passed the message along. Of the captives brought to Yenan, among whom I conducted a survey, the percentage of deserters and voluntary captives grew from 10% in 1940 to 44% in 1944. At no anti-Japanese militarist front in Asia or the Pacific did psychological warfare achieve such success. When I joined the observer group I heard from some Americans who had gone into guerrilla territory and had been in Yenan for several months that the Chinese communists were not communists. An American officer told me, "These people are not communists in the strictest sense of the term. They are agrarians with emphasis on land reform. They are not communizing China. I listened to mess hall conversations where American officers discussed and argued with the Chinese liaison officers. The liaison officers would say that they were communists, that they would go through the stage of new democracy and will have socialism. The Americans would say they just couldn't be communists because they had popular support, clean government, and used persuasion and education rather than intimidation and persecution. The Americans insisted that the Yan'an Chinese did not act like communists. How are communists supposed to behave? The liaison officers asked, had the Americans seen any communists before they came into Yan'an? The Americans said they had not. Then where did they get such ideas? The liaison officers asked. Questions like this stumped the Americans. The American observers made objective reports of what they saw in North China, and they were generally favorably impressed by the broad participation in government by the people of all classes, reduced land rent, clean government, active resistance against the Japanese invaders, and the educational program that reached the peasant masses who were generally neglected in the nationalist areas. I enjoyed listening to such discussions. We Americans knew almost nothing of Marxism or scientific socialism, which the liaison officers talked about. Perhaps there was no American observer in Yan'an, including the generals who made short visits and Ambassador Patrick J. Hurly, who had given time to reading the works of Marx, Engels, and Lenin. In the waiting room of the bathhouse we used 3 times a week. The portraits of these men hung from the wall, alongside those of Roosevelt, Stalin, Churchill, and Chiang Kai-shek. We were among people who studied from the works of Marx, Engels, Lenin, Stalin, and Mao Zedong more seriously than we did from works of Plato, Aristotle, Kant, Berkeley, and John Dewey. As a GI interested in Asia because my parents came from there, and because the majority of the people were farmers just like my parents and me during the greater part of my life, I engaged the Chinese in conversation. Thus I met Chiang Kai-ta, known to be a dull platform speaker, but a satirist with a sharp pen that ripped Chiang Kai-shek's published works to shreds and made a fool of the generalissimo in Chinese eyes. One of Chiang's books which suffered from such a treatment was China's Destiny. It was Chiang who told us during a conversation that Mao Zedong's New Democracy is an excellent example of a product of a Chinese Marxist. Mao knows China, he said, and this opinion I found was quite general among students and intellectuals even in Chongqing, then Chiang Kai-shek's stronghold. And I learned that the students and intellectuals in China who were classed as liberals read Mao and the works of Marxists in their stride. Under a thought control environment they seemed to be well read. They showed, on the other hand, surprise at our lack of knowledge. Students as well as Chinese communist leaders asked us Americans about the trade union movement in the U.S., and about the giant corporations with their interlocking directorates and trusts. From about 30 State Department Foreign Service officers, Army officers, and enlisted men, only 2 GIs could converse on American trade unions. Some of the officers were vehemently anti-union, and this shocked many Chinese. Our acquaintance with Marxism could have been generally termed as non-existent. Months later, after all of us observers had departed, a U.S. Army major illustrated this prevalent condition among Americans. He was the lone officer stationed in Yan'an as liaison officer for General George Marshall, who was then mediating between the nationalists and the communists. A vice president of an American publishing firm visited Yan'an looking for Chinese manuscripts which his firm might bring out in the U.S. head-off to the major, the only American in one of 2 principal political centers of China, whose 475 million people could either experience peace or civil war, depending on the outcome of the negotiations. As the major relaxed on his bed, his thoughts were far away from China with its complicated political situation. The visiting publisher asked him what he was thinking about so seriously and how did he size up the Chinese situation. The major sat up on his bed and explained that he had been giving his thoughts to the ways and means of improving the sewer system of Los Angeles. He explained that he was a plumber by profession. The book publisher who told me this story later was aghast. On the day the courier plane came in and he was about to rush to the airstrip, the major chased after him. "Hey," he said, "maybe you can enlighten me. I've got a question in my mind that's been bothering me for some time. I don't know whether I can help you, but I'll try," said the publisher. "But I've got to rush because the plane's taking off." Then in dead seriousness the major asked, "Can you tell me who is this guy Karl Marx that these Chinese talk so much about? Was he the first Russian dictator?" Taken aback by this question, the publisher said it would take a long time to explain who Karl Marx was, and he rushed off to catch the transport, leaving the confused major standing in the dust churned up by the departing truck.